says we always like to negotiate limits of liability, indemnification, warranty, use of third parties. And it says, the question is really what is reasonable when it comes to these, and are there other terms that are critical to de-risk your contract? So let's start first of all with limits of liability, because we're now talking about a risk event has happened, or
That's
we're trying
right.
to prevent it, or we're trying to recover. So let's start, I mean, you're an attorney. What are your thoughts on the limits of liability?
Yeah, so this is awesome because it's absolutely true. So basically, it limits how much loss one party is going to pay to the other when the risk event happens and there's a loss that can't be controlled and we can determine whose fault it is. They
Yes,
don't teach
very
you that in
critical.
law
Those are
school.
essential that you have to have those in place before you can actually act, right?
That's right. So we spend tons of time about something that's actually pretty complex because you have to be able to have identified a risk event. You have to be able
Yeah.
to have identified a certain kind of loss. And then you have to be able to determine with accuracy that it is one party's fault. So when we talk about things like infringement of third party rights, right,
Yep.
so I have intellectual property, Lawrence infringes on my intellectual property. And Linda, I sue you. You're like, hey, you got this de-risking your contract workshop, and Lawrence is infringed on my intellectual property. I have to win my lawsuit against him, and I
Mhm.
have to be a clear victor, and then I can somehow get losses. And so we spend a lot of time talking about this because it matters from the chief financial officer, what's the potential liability. It matters because every once in a million years, these things happen. There is a loss and there is a clear problem
Mhm.
or bad actor, but we do spend a lot of our time trying to limit what our losses are going to be and missing the point of a performance-based contract, which is to perform.
So very specifically on limits of liability, one thing that we very often see is that the liability, basically that the financial exposure is limited to what they've been paid in the contract,
Hmm.
right? Which sometimes is very little
Hmm.
in the grand scheme of the world. What are your thoughts about those limits on liability? I mean, it's a
I
very broad question, Jen,
I
and I,
call it no, I call it the donut hole. This is a brilliant question. This is the donut hole, and that is the likely thing that's going to happen might so far exceed that cap, but it's
exactly.
so unusual. And you also have your insurance provisions, but it's financially crippling to all of your suppliers if you try to pass on what the true loss would be if. So let me give you a very real example. I work in aerospace. I support some aerospace manufacturers like second tiers. And so extended supply chain. So of course, what happens is I put a part in your plane, Linda. You say, okay, I need to know that this has been manufactured, in the United States, blah, blah, blah. And I provide a certificate over to you that's been falsified by my supplier. Okay,
Yeah.
now oh holy heck happens. Now the limitation of liability and the indemnification clauses are very real. The problem is that if I'm manufacturing and I just hand it over to you a fraudulent certificate, my cap is $1 million because that's all my little part is worth to you annually.
Mhm.
But your losses might be 10 million to take all the fleet out and rotate them out and get that part out, because if you've got a fraudulent certificate, you could have a fraudulent product. So
Right.
you can't come
And with
after me.
airplanes, we don't want that. We want the good products in
Right.
those airplanes, yes.
Exactly. But your losses are 10 million to do that. My limitation liability is capped at 1 million. Someone's eating a $9 million gap. And so if we don't really understand what the risk is, then we don't really know how to mitigate it. And you mitigate it by understanding who in the world is your supply chain, and me, making sure that I'm not passing along fraudulent certificates and that I
Uh-huh.
actually have the
Hence,
right kind of part, which is
third
performance
party, yeah.
in a performance-based contract. So we don't worry about the performance. We don't have enough QA people, the right QA people. We don't have enough testing of parts. We don't do any of that nonsense because that costs money. But instead, you'll spend a ton of money on me to negotiate a limitation of liability that's capped at $1 million.
Well,
And I'll
it
also
is, yeah,
add, it's more complex even than Jeanette was just implying, because the OEMs in that aerospace and defense industry are usually self-insured, and
yeah,
they have specific policies for certain things that require them to have certain liability caps in their supply chain, because it's an industry where people sue all the time, right?
yeah.
And so you got to know your industry, you got to know your supply base, you got to know your subs of subs of subs of subs, and have flow down and visibility throughout the supply chain and all those kind of things, so that you can not only work it contractually, but as Janet was implying, you can figure out what's real and how do I prevent it by having actual first time quality of parts, which is what really everybody wants, and
Mhm.
not just, push lawsuits back and forth.
Well, and that's a very, very complex industry, and it ties in so nicely with third-party risk, because third-party risk is all about getting into business with the right third party in the first place, right? By doing your homework. I mean, there's lots of griping that goes on, it takes too long, etc. And at one point in time, I used to lend money for a bank. I'll tell you, it's easy to send the money out the door. It's really hard to get it back if you got a problem. And it's the same thing with any form of contract. So the limits on liability, that's why we need to work with experienced people basically in the business and procurement and attorneys to sort it out, because maybe your exposure is 10 million and you're only ever going to have $1 million cap. Well, that being the case, I would have to say that do a very good job of knowing who you're doing business with and how they manage quality and standards and controls, et cetera, down the line. Because if you're trying to get into subcontractors and fourth parties, FISPs, et cetera, you can't examine them. You don't have a contract with them. You need to
Yes.
know, where the up goes.